First speaker is Alain Bertaud. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to hear him speak. I was really excited that he had come to NYU and is doing such great research. He's a senior research scholar at NYU Stern's Urbanization Project. He has a long, fascinating career where he was the principal urban planner at the World Bank. I forgive you for that. He worked in places like Bangkok, San Salvador, Port-au-Prince, Sana'a in Yemen, New York, Paris, Tlemcen in Algeria, Chandigarh, one of the first planned cities in developing country. I'd love to hear more about that. Bertaud's research, a lot of it is joint with his wife, Marie-Agnès, and it aims to bridge the gap between operational urban planning and the field of urban economics that we heard exposited so well in the previous presentation by Ed Glazer. He's currently working on a book that sounds really great. It's tentatively titled Order Without Design. And that's related to the title of his talk today, which is the effects of top-down design versus spontaneous order on housing affordability, examples from Southeast Asia. So please join me in welcoming Alain Bertaud.
Thank you. The theme of my talk today is very much related to the first two presentations. On the first one, Paul was explaining, in fact, what I would call top-down design. That means at a certain point, when a city expands, you need to have an infrastructure which is going to link all the different parts of the city. And at this moment, we do not know a market mechanism which will establish this infrastructure. So Paul described how at a certain time in the history of New York, the grid was imposed. It was not a question whether the width of the avenue or the street were optimum. Nobody could know that. It was just the important thing was to do this grid and to separate very early public space from private space. Then the next presentation was Bill, and he showed us at the micro level what happened within the block. And the wonderful things that happened within the block, the enormous transformation which happened, were made possible because a lot of individuals took an initiative. They were not coordinated. That is really the wealth of the city. You need a lot of people who take initiative which cannot be known in advance. You don't, and which associate, but they associate only by grouping each other because they have the same interest. Bill also mentioned something interesting, and which is more precisely the theme of my talk now, is that at a certain point, when the garment industry moved out of the block, the city zoned it industrial, and they were very reluctant to change the zoning. And when they realized that a lot of artists were living there because it was illegally, but they decided to rezone it. But instead of saying, well, zone it whatever, they say for artists. I was even expecting that some planner would say, well, the north of the block will be for people who do watercolor, and the south will be for acrylic or something like that. That's what. Don't laugh. This is tragic. I have reviewed some. Sorry, I have reviewed some 4 years ago a new master plan for St. Petersburg. And the planners had the good idea to say that all activity which relate to paper should be linked together, in one area. And it should be, so for instance, people who were printing business cards should be next to a paper mill, for instance. instead of being in the city center. So, you know, these zoning things are a little crazy. Recently, I was in New Zealand, and immediately adjacent to the built-up area of Auckland, there was a zone that I have never seen before, which says bush living. Bush living in a special zone, which means that you have to live off-grid. You know, so it's a very, very large plot. So you see, those zoning things are very, and you know, start tripping from the legitimate use of the, you know, planning of the infrastructure, which is completely legitimate, even indispensable, and they creep down to trying to regulate the most minute aspect of land development and standards. So in reality, a city is made of two things. One, top-down design, mostly infrastructure. There's not much reason to go below that. And then one which I would call spontaneous order, which is basically what Bill was describing, Bill and Laura were describing, that people see a plot of land and they say, well, we could use it that way. Somebody decide that the land has a potential to have 5 floors instead of 2 floors, and that will finance the change, and they will do it. Without waiting for some government or some planner to tell them, well, this will be okay, for art, but not for, for retail, for instance. So let us give an example of those top-down design, which I think is legitimate. This is the master plan of Ahmedabad. Basically, it shows a network of streets. It is not exactly like the grid of Manhattan, but it's a grid, in a certain way. This is top-down design. It means that really, certainly engineers have calculated traffic and things like that, but let us not put our expectation too high. There is no way to know what is the correct width of, say, for instance, those ring road 20 years in advance. We have no idea. However, it's very important to just do it. Just do it. It's your best guess. Let us look at another example of necessary top-down design. This is Paris metropolitan area. I don't have I cannot show you here exactly. The Paris you all know is a tiny little dot in the middle of this map. This is metropolitan Paris, which has 10 million people, and this represents the network of rail transport, urban rail transport in Paris. So you see here, this is a top-down design in the sense that somebody had decided where the terminal will be. You see that, for instance, in the southeast, Melun is the last station. Probably a political decision, and a mix of political decision and a technical one, but again, without completely knowing what the future will be, but it's the best guess. And again, this is necessary. You cannot, you can neither optimize nor agonize too much on, whether this is a correct thing or not. The important thing is to do it. Now, those two examples, in my opinion, are completely legitimate. Let us see now what happened when the planners tried to expand, their planning power down. So here, a lot of you are familiar with this image. This was Corbusier plan, the plan voisin called for Paris CBD. It was supposed to replace, all the area north of the Louvre, that the Marais now and things like that, by just towers, which were all identical. And again, the justification of the planner in doing that is that basically Corbusier thought that the French were spending too much time in bistro and cafe. He may have the point, but and therefore the best way would be to have only office building, residential area, and then a lot of space for jogging. And when you are not working or living in your house, you will go jogging, and that's why those towers are in the park. And that was his idea of thing. So that, of course, all the apartments here were designed in advance. that means that the distribution of the size of apartment will be not necessarily the same, but will be decided by the planner. There was no way to introduce different type of thing. So that, again, a gross abuse of the planning power. It's a caricature, I agree, but, and you could say, well, it's in the caricature of the 30s. It was a time which was, had a tendency to totalitarian. There was a fascination. Intellectuals were fascinated by totalitarian movement. You were either a fascist or a Marxist. And, well, not so. This is something which is in the book now. It's a large neighborhood. It's a plan from Zaha Hadid, who was a very well-known architect, international architect. She has been asked, her office has been asked to do a plan for a very large area in the southeast of Istanbul to redevelop it. And indeed, the area is a derelict industrial zone, which is obsolete. And here is a plan which is coming. Again, it's very similar to Corbusier in the sense that every building is planned in advance to give a certain allure. So you realize that, of course, we are not at the same period. We are not among the cubists here. We are more among, I don't know what would be character. I mean, she characterized it as calligraphic. But and what is interesting is that, you see, these are what the building will look like. So again, it's planned from above. You cannot imagine, the transformation that we saw in Green Street. You cannot imagine anything happening like that. My guess is that you couldn't even open a Starbucks in this thing. So, at the neighborhood level, you need more spontaneity, and this spontaneity will allow change of land use, which reflect our new economy, and reflect also, by the way, the different trade-off that people make between street space, height of building, floor space, and things like that. So this is the neighborhood which is just close. It's adjacent to the plan you have seen. This is a Kartalpendik, though, in Istanbul. That's just next to it. You see that was certainly grew as a much more spontaneous even than the grid of Manhattan. There is a street network, but you can see that the alignment of building are relatively spontaneous. You see also some variation. There is a mosque in the middle there, which just in the middle of a block. And then you have some apartment building in the middle of those four-story buildings. So this is the way it looks on the ground. Again, you can imagine this street changing exactly the way Green Street had changed. With, there is a bank here on the side, there is somebody selling newspaper, and this spontaneity can allow these changes. I am sure that within few years, given the proximity to one railway station, you will have the taller building, probably. This is one of my favorite building in Hanoi. Most of my colleague planners revolt when they see that and say, well, they should really have rules and enforce them. To me, this building explains exactly what is spontaneous order. Why this, there is a person here who puts all her savings in building this building on one lot, which is 5 meters wide on 20 meters long. Now, in most cities of the world, nobody will be allowed to build a 6-story building on a lot like that. I think it's a very good thing. This person is making the maximum use of the floor space. On 3 levels, you have a retail. It's a woman fashion, actually. You have two floors of offices, and the top are all residential. And I think that there is no reason for top-down design to prevent something like that from happening. Yes, it would have been more economical if this person could have purchased 2 or 3 lots, and it would have probably saved on corridors and staircase, and especially the elevator, if they did that. However, if if the owner of this plot did that, it's precisely because the transaction cost of acquiring more building around it would have been so high, so the alternative would have been to do nothing, to stay at 3 levels. This is another example in Ahmedabad, in a suburb of Ahmedabad, which had escaped zoning regulation up to now, although the planners are making good order, that will not happen again. You see buildings which are rather ordinary. There's a pergola. The way it's designed, it doesn't follow and do not follow any regular pattern, except that it reflects exactly the consumer choice. It reflects exactly the choice of the people who live there. Eventually, this building, I'm sure, is going to go higher, given the land prices in Ahmedabad. So the problem I have is that, again, this constant encroachment of planning over market. I acknowledge that there is absolutely necessity of planning infrastructure to link different parts of the city together. But when you go down, there is a moment where top-down planning should stop. And it should be, let's say, the trade-off that the users themselves are making, which will reflect the built environment. I will concentrate only on one aspect here, is one type of top-down planning which is particularly damaging in developing countries, but also here, by the way, in the United States, is minimum consumption standard for housing. That means in every country there is a regulation which says you cannot build on a plot which is less than, say, 100 square meter, and no house should be built which is less than, say, 45 square meter, for instance. There are many other regulations, but that's, those minimum standards are very damaging. Why are they damaging? They are damaging because they are imposing a consumption on everybody in the city, a minimum consumption that maybe some of them cannot afford. Now, if they cannot afford it under current market condition, the logic will be for the government to impose these rules, say, do not worry. We are going, if the minimum house size is 40 square meter and you cannot afford it, we are going to provide it for you, because that's a minimum. Of course, the government never does that because they don't even calculate how many people will, cannot afford that. So I propose here just to an approach to that a graph. So the graph which is on the left shows below an income distribution curve. This curve, horizontally you have the household income, and vertically you have the number of households. So that represents the distribution of income within the city. You see that this is absolutely indispensable for any city to have an income distribution curve like that. The idea to have, low-income housing, middle-income housing, and things, those categories are not very useful. You need a curve because you have an enormous diversity of income, and depending on the number of people who have a certain income, the policy will be very different. The curve above it, the graph above this, still on the left, horizontally you have the income also, same scale as the graph below, but vertically you have the housing consumption. So either it could be a number which represents, an index of consumption, or let's imagine that it represents the size of a dwelling in square meter, for instance. So you see here, if I take the line DF, it tells me two things. It tells me that for this income, on the current market, I can have a consumption which corresponds, to F, the intersection of the curve AB, and it tells me also how many people can afford that within the city. Now, what does a planner do? The planner at the same time is saying we need a minimum consumption, because some of those people at the bottom, on the left-hand part of the curve are very poor, and therefore they consume very little. And we want them to consume more. Now, as soon as you say that, so you establish a minimum consumption. Very often, by the way, I blame planners. Politicians are very often to blame for that more than planners. When they get elected, or they always make promises that everybody should have at least a house of 40 square meter or 50 square meter, 100 square meter, and so they immediately set this level at a certain number. So here, for instance, on the right curve, I have a level M consumption, which corresponds to, let's say, a minimum floor area, which cuts the consumption line in H. And if you go down to the income distribution, the yellow area tell you all the people who do not have an income which is sufficient to pay for this minimum. Now, what's going to happen here now? Well, the city is going to have probably a public housing program, and they will announce a program of 100,000 units a year or 1 million units a year. In reality, they are going to do 200 units a year. And the rest of the people who are in my yellow curve here, the yellow part of the curve, are going to be living in illegal settlement. So suddenly they were living in poor settlements, which were not very comfortable, but now on top of it, they are going to become illegal. And illegal only because this arbitrary line here, MHN, that I've drawn on my graph here. The politician could have been, let's say, a little less ambitious and put M a little lower. Immediately, maybe 100,000 people will have been in a legal situation instead of illegal. Now, the problem being illegal is not necessarily that that you will be expelled. This was done in the 60s. It's very rare now that the government will bulldoze a low-income settlement. It's relatively rare. But that means that you will have no access to water supply, usually, very often, no drainage, no garbage removal. That if you want to sell your property, you can. In all this informal area, you have a market, but you will have no guarantee of law. That means if somebody play a bad trick on you, you cannot complain. You cannot go and see the justice, to recover it. So it has a lot of disadvantages of living there. So this imposition of a minimum housing standard cause a lot of problems. In a way, make the poor even poorer, and in the less, I would say, comfortable situation. Now, there are, again, the government has a tendency to say, well, we will solve the problem by building houses for the poor. And I have two examples here. One that certainly Sugar Hill, a housing project. When you see the mayor cutting a ribbon in front of a low-income housing project, it's not serious. Because if you think of all the need for low-income housing in New York or anywhere else, if every time the government built 150 units, they had to cut the ribbon, the mayor, it would be a full-time job, to cut the ribbon in front of this. So this is not serious. It's a number of, it's just for the press. Now, what is interesting about top-down design too is that the design is practically the same, whether it's in New York or in Ahmedabad, although the conditions are very different. Again, it's a design which comes from the top. The trade-off between open space, floor space, corridors, and all that has all been done by the government. Now, there are some positive aspects. There are some positive, let's say, case where some government had, had the wisdom to eliminate this minimum housing consumption, sometime a little by accident. So I will describe very quickly the compound of Surabaya, which in Indonesia, and this is a policy, by the way, which is the same for all Indonesia, Hanoi urban villages, and the Shenzhen and Sheikh building. These are examples where the government suddenly refrained from planning to the last minute, to the last degree of detail, and let the people build what they want, but connected them to the infrastructure. So here is a plan of, this is downtown Surabaya. It's a plan, in yellow you see those are the kampong, and in purple are commercial area along major roads. Within the kampong, there are small roads, very often about 4 or 5 meter wide, just one car can pass, and then many other roads are only 2 meters or even can be accessed just about, by 50 centimeter to access the middle of the block. The advantage of that is that everybody consume whatever they can afford, so they can locate, by the way, close to the center of the city, close to the job. They have access to water. The garbage is removed regularly. The kampong is considered like a condominium. So it's a very large condominium, but it's a condominium. So the city has an agreement with the kampong, management, which is, and they decide when to collect the garbage, where. They connect to water supply, they connect to the sewer, and they drain the area. So in Surabaya, you have also middle-class housing, So on the right here, you see a typical middle-class housing compound, and you compare it to the kampong. The advantage of the kampong that, again, you have a huge variety of plot size, including, the smallest one, about 10 square meter, but you have also a mix of income there. And you have access to the same school, to the same water supply, and to the same drain, and the garbage is removed. This is what it looks like inside. You see one of those kampong. You see a mix. You have some middle-class houses, but you have also very, very poor houses, which reflecting, again, the very low income. Here you see more this condominium. This is the entrance of a kampong. All of them have a name. There is an entrance. There is a postal address. This is the inside. This was built by the community. It was a little wider. They decided to build a bench. One service which is very important, at night they have street light. The streets are only 2 meter wide, 2 meter 50 here, but they have street light, which is a very, very important aspect, again, of nice livelihood. This is another example in Hanoi. Hanoi, as Hanoi expands, there are a lot of villages, and those villages are allowed, the villagers are allowed to retain their land there. The agricultural land is expropriated by the government, but where they live, they can use it the way they want, without using government regulations. And what they do, they build in height, which is a cultural tradition in Vietnam, actually, building high. And they rent housing on the top floor to new migrants. And of course, by definition, they adjust the rent. The rent and the facilities are adjusted so that the people can afford it by necessity. The government has a good sense when they build the infrastructure to build it around the villages, to let the village, they don't do a Robert Modest operation. They try to avoid completely the villages, but they provide on the outside of the village the school and the health facility they need, and they provide the infrastructure which allow those former villagers and the migrants to have access to transport and infrastructure. So this is again income distribution curve. The result of that is that there are practically no slum in Hanoi. For a city which is growing extremely fast, this is pretty good. No slum. That means only the part at the left of the graph, which is red here, these are people you could say live in relatively pretty bad condition, but that's a very small part. Most of the orange part here, the lowest income, are in fact villages, people who live in villages under those conditions. So some of them, again, consume relatively little. You may have an entire family in one room, but they have access to water, garbage is removed, they have access to transport, and the area is drained. They are never flooded. My last example is Shenzhen, the Enshek village. This is the center of Shenzhen, or rather, the center is to the right of the image here, to the left of the image, sorry, here. And the village we are talking about are this little square. I'm not sure you can see it here. This is what it looks like. Again, the same thing here as in Hanoi, except that here, the farmers, instead of keeping their own house and building above it, have entirely restructured the area. The government didn't do it. It's a village collective who did it. Restructured the area and decided the trade-off they wanted to make between the width of street and the floor space. So you end up with 5-story building surrounded by 2-meter or 3-meter streets. Now, this was their decision. And if you look at the rent there, you can see that a lot of people are quite happy to live there. They are making a trade-off between floor space. They try to maximize floor space. And for doing that, they minimize street space. But they can do that. You see, these are the streets. They can do that because you see here those little squares. These are the houses I've shown. But on the sides, you have the big avenue here. So all the drainage, all the infrastructure, all the transport is there. They are at a walking distance from the city center, walking distance for metro station in Shenzhen. Now, spontaneous development do not succeed necessarily the way, I told you 3 success stories. They can be pretty horrible. They can be pretty horrible when the government do not recognize that they exist. This is a master plan of Cairo. Cairo, this little blob within the black line here is a main Cairo city, which now has around, this part has about 14 million people. And the master plan for Cairo called for moving new cities, within, you see, a distance of about 100 kilometers back and forth. The government developed all this area in blue there, are developed by government at rather high standard. They are entirely planned to the last plot. But this is where the people are living. Now, this is just on the fringe of Cairo. It's developing in agricultural field. The government has decided that nobody should build on agricultural land, although this land here, the area I'm showing is only at 7 kilometers from the center, from Meydan el-Tahrir, center of Cairo. So you understand why people want to live there rather than 50 kilometers from the center, as the government has planned. Now, the problem you see here, there is a highway. There are 2 highways crossing each other with a nice exchange. None of this is connected to all this settlement here. The streets are also 4 meters, but except, in the kampong, the streets were seldom, the kampong was seldom larger than 500 meters, sometimes up to 800 meters maximum. Here you have kilometers and kilometers. This is the way it looks, with, a little closer. Those streets, so there is practically no way here even to drain the area. Transport is extremely difficult. You can use practically only a motorcycle, and it's still very long because if the street are 4 meters and you have to go through several kilometers of street of 4 meters, this is very long. And so you see, these are in fact middle-class people. They are not really poor people. They are people who cannot afford the standard set by government, but can afford an apartment in this area. Now you can imagine area like that, which with progressively they install drainage and sewer, but many of those settlements are only a seepage pit and things like that, And some area they have boat water, but that's a lot of struggle because it's illegal, and officially they do not exist. So you see, you have this thing. This on the top image, 29 kilometers from Cairo city center, you have all the infrastructure to the least detail. You have even the street light, by the way, there. And there, 7 kilometers from the city center, where most of the people are living at very high density, you have nothing in terms of infrastructure. So this is what I call, top-down planning going, So the important thing, I think, in most countries is to remove the minimum housing standards. Now, what about here in New York? Well, we are getting into the same problem, although it's not quite the same as Cairo. You know that in Queens, for instance, or where I live in New Jersey, across the water, in most neighborhoods, you are not allowed to, for instance, split your house. You know, if you have a house of, say, 1,500 square feet, you are not allowed to have two kitchens. In Queens, you are not allowed to build a so-called granny flat. So there is no adjustment possible to either the number of houses which can be built in a certain neighborhood or their size. You know, once, for instance, if I have my 1,800 square feet house, this is it. Very often even the neighborhood will control the floor ratio, which will not will even prevent me even to have one house a little larger. You know, it's frozen there. I think this is an example of top-down design. Now, this top-down design, in this case, it is supported by the community, you know. But because, again, it's a problem of the people who is here against the one who potentially will come here. And in our democracy, sadly, said, especially in a local democracy, the person who are not yet here or want to move are losing compared to the one who are here. So you know, again, I'm not at all against planning. I think planning is necessary. Projections are necessary. You know, it's completely legitimate for a planner to say, with my knowledge of the demand, the market, the supply, I think that within 20 years, the density of this neighborhood would be such. Therefore, I need to bring that many cubic meters of water in this area. The traffic would be that much. I need a road there. I need an exchange. That's completely legitimate. What is not legitimate is to transform your projections into regulations. You know, if you think that the density in Queens will be 50 people per hectare, I don't think it's right to say, therefore, we should have that many dwelling units per hectare because this is my projection. Now, some planner will say, hey, we need those projections, we need to enforce them because, you know, I have designed a pipe to bring the water, and if the density double because people need more housing, the pipe will be too small. Now, that's a problem with planners with a background as engineer or architect like myself, is that we understand building cost. We know the cost of pipe. We do not understand the cost of land. And you know, the cost of a pipe in a street, an additional pipe in the street, is nothing compared to the cost of land. In the example of Green Street that we were shown, to me, one of the trigger of the change was that the house of ill repute were using 2-floor or 3-floor, and suddenly you had an industrialist who realized that with the technology, he could build 8-floor and at a certain cost, and it is this difference between the cost of land, you know, and the amount of floor space you could build would trigger the change. So this is something that planners do not understand. And when you prevent an area from growing because there is a pipe in the ground which is that big and it should be that big, you are really wasting an enormous amount, not only of land, but you are also pushing people outside the city. So you increase the transport. You will have any way to provide the infrastructure. You know, if you don't double the infrastructure in your street, you'll have to provide it outside. And at the same time, you increase transport cost. You decrease the welfare of people who will have longer time to travel. And maybe you even eliminate some jobs and some industry that way. Thank you.
Yes. A lot of the codes you don't like have to do with life safety. And I looked at that Chinese village,
Yes,
and I wondered, you know, the handshake.
yes.
What happens if there's a fire? What happens if someone needs an ambulance
Well,
when you have only a 2-meter wide access road?
Well, you know, this has been up for quite a number of years. I'm sure there have been some fires, and I'm sure a lot of people need an ambulance. They made a trade-off. They developed a system, you know, of stretchers on wheels and things like that. They have a system, you know, the system evolved. The same thing in the kampong. I'm not completely sure how they remove the garbage in the handshake building. But if you go in the street, you see that they are relatively clean. So they must have a good system. In the kampong, they have a very elaborate system to remove the garbage, you know, before they handed it to the municipality. They have a system of tricycle. They have first a wheelbarrow, then the wheelbarrow emptying the tricycle bring it to the outside. So, you know, again, I agree with you that it would be nice if instead of you know, the handshake building, that it looked like a suburb of New Jersey. However, that's not in the play. You know, they did not have an alternative between living there or living 20 kilometers from Shenzhen. That was the alternative. So they make this trade-off. Don't forget that this was made by people who wanted to rent. So in order to rent, they have to have people who are willing to rent. You know, it's very different from a public housing building where you have a subsidy and the government is telling you, you can live, if you want the subsidy, you're obliged to live there. Here, all the people who live in those buildings are volunteers. And they could, indeed, if you look at, let's say, low-income housing in the suburb of Shenzhen, you will find some which are much more comfortable than that. But they are doing this trade-off. In Paris, in the center of Paris, in the 6th arrondissement, which is now one of the most expensive in Paris, you have on the market, you go to see a real estate broker, you have housing apartment of 9 square meters, you know, 90 square feet, which are selling for $500,000. These are volunteer. I'm not saying that it's nice and comfortable to live in 90 square feet, but if there are people who are willing to do that, they are making a trade-off between, you know, living in Saint-Germain-des-Prés on 9 square meters or living in the suburb of Paris with 2 hours commute, you know, so in 150 square meters.
Well, I just hope there's not a big fire there. And people regret their trade-off at that point, just like sometimes they like to live looking over by the water, and they regret it when it floods.
Yeah, but it's a question of resources. You know, you assume here that they have a choice between wide road and small road. If they had wider road, they will have even less space for themselves, or none at all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Your presentation, as many others, emphasize the market as a driving force to balance the supply and demand for the use of urban space, but
Yes.
there are different actors in the market with very uneven distribution of power, and that includes the power to influence government in drawing regulation. So could you please address some of that?
Well, yes, I have seen that, you know, I've worked with municipalities the last 40 years, so indeed I have seen a lot of power exerted by either private sector or the government. Usually the power is in the other direction. I will put to you that most of the land use regulation we have in the suburb of New York are there to protect the neighborhood against poor people, not to help poor people. So the idea that what I would like is to see the market works better and works more anonymously. That means that people will be free to consume what they want, where they want, rather than have law which, on the pretext of sometimes the environment or keeping the neighborhood, prevent poor people from coming to a neighborhood which will be convenient for them. You know, the only way in a market economy, the only way for poor people to live in the neighborhood they want is to outbid the rich. And they can outbid the rich only by consuming less. And that's a trade-off they can make. So if regulation prevents them from consuming less, then the regulation excludes them. I was, some years ago, I was working in San Salvador in Central America, and they had just prepared a master plan for the whole city, and they were very proud. It was very detailed. And when I use the standard of all the residential area, different part of the master plan, you know, it's called R1, R2, R3, R4, taking the price of land, the price of infrastructure and construction, I could convert this master plan and saying, if your income is less than that, don't live here. You know, that's what's a master plan. If I apply that to the entire master plan, 50% of the population could not afford any legal plot. So you see, again, the power here, I think, work in the other direction. You know, you have to make the market work better for the poor because it's a rich who are rigging it.
You're talking about the power to consume. I'm thinking more about the power to supply. So, for instance, if you're assuming that poor people own the land, and I'm thinking, well, I come from São Paulo, which is a city that suffers a lot with speculation in real estate.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking about the power of large construction companies, for instance, to buy a block and decide that there's going to be a high-rise building there. And compare that to the power of people that maybe have been living there for generations, and even though they own the land,
Yes.
they, like other neighbors, sold, and then there's a huge imbalance.
I think that property rights should be protected, if that's the case, you know, and property rights have to be established. Sometimes there are traditional property rights which are not respected. They should be respected. But your question here is really of property rights. You know, it's not a question of market. If somebody takes away, steal your land, this is not the way I understand market.
Building on the last question,
Yeah.
couple of things. I guess the ultimate question is there, where is the place for regulation? Where do you draw the line? And just to, in the case of Queens, where you have a single-family house
Yes.
and not permitted to subdivide it, that's quite different from, you know, a poor country where you just want to, the balance of resource versus what you're going to provide is what you were describing there. So, but then, I guess the question is, at what point is it a legitimate public concern about the potential safety to others who are in the immediate context, where you have, you know, building codes to.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that there should be some building code, and in particular fire regulation and things like that. Don't get me wrong. It should not be to the point that it excludes a lot of people from housing, because then you don't get, you know, if you say in order that there be no fire, then half of the people who live in areas which are illegal, therefore, which are, you know, that's not a good bargain. But I agree that there should be regulation. In particular, one regulation that I am very keen on is that when you connect, you see those condominium to the main infrastructure, this will be a very strict regulation so that the connection itself follows some rules so that it doesn't obstruct, you know, the thing. So you know, I think that there is a tendency among planners and politicians and people to exaggerate the negative externalities and to ignore the positive one. A city is a balance of negative and positive externality. Every new person coming into a city creates a negative externality, you know. L'enfer, c'est les autres, you know. And, you know, so at a certain point, you have to balance the two. In the case of Queen, so from you living there, you say, well, I like the neighborhood just as it is. If somebody are allowed to double up, there will be one extra car in the street. Maybe they will make noise. Yeah, it's true. It is an externality. But if you have, you know, 40% of the population in New York who is spending 50 or more percent of their income on housing, this is a damn big negative externality. So you have to balance that with the little inconvenience that you have to park your car in your street, that, by the way, you didn't pay for, you have to balance the two.
So it's a little bit like health and safety versus lifestyle or preferences.
Yes. Yes, in a certain way, yes. But you see, the question, sorry, the question is, the question is property right. Do your property right stop at your property, or does it expand ad infinitum? It's my guess is that unless your neighbor creates a grave nuisance, like dumping his dirty water in your backyard, your property right is within your property.
Hello. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm very fascinated by the examples you gave, for example, the compound and also the handshake community in Shenzhen. So my question is in reference to this morning's talk about the evolution of that one block in New York. It seems by planning the community this way that they didn't give too much room to, say, evolution or changing in these communities. I'm not saying I don't know whether this is a problem in the future, but can you comment on that?
Yes, I think that, a community can change, and what change a community are economic forces, and in particular the price of land. The price of land and the rent, this is what moves things. That was moving, Green Street. So in terms of the kampong, I have followed the kampong over 35 years now, regularly going there, and I tell you, the evolution of the housing stock in the kampong reflect, the extraordinary development in the last years of Indonesia. Before you could see only, wooden shacks with corrugated iron roof. Now you can see a lot of houses which are quite desirable, actually, although accessible. You cannot have your own car if you live there. I know 2 university professors in Surabaya who live in a kampong and are extremely satisfied by it. So and it's not a shack, it's relatively large. So those things evolve. Now, how would the handshake building in Shenzhen evolve? They have a little less room for evolving because they are already so dense. It reminds me, in Hong Kong in the 60s, they had a lot of slums, and they built high-rise building, and they had also a lot of refugees coming from China. They built a high-rise building for them in a very good location with schools, and eventually it was pretty Spartan, 1 room per family, and they had to share a kitchen with 2 other families, which for a Chinese family, like a French family, must be very painful. Eventually, those people were absorbed in the city economy, and they moved into the rest of the housing stock, and those buildings were demolished. So I think it's possible that the handshake building, after 20 years, will be changed, demolished, maybe one by one, when there is no more need for them. Thank you very much.